Hey, Katie, thanks for joining
Hey,
us.
Rich. So glad to be with you.
And so good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this week's 6 sessions. And one I think will be a nice change of pace. This week, it's less about the growth outcome like copywriting, search, or sales, and more about the people behind the growth. I'm excited about all of the 6 sessions, but this is one I've been counting down the days to, as it's a different angle on growth and one I'm super passionate about as a business leader. Today, we're going to talk about culture, leadership, and inclusiveness, what they mean for growth, and why you should be striving to create a remarkable environment where your teams can thrive. We're going to hear from someone who leads a team that is continually smashing awards out of the park with Glassdoor, Fortune, and Best Places to Work, to name a few. She's the chief people. I nearly got the whole way through and got without stuffing it up. She is chief people officer for the #1 CRM platform on the planet, leading initiatives that focus on not only the employee and candidate experience, but how they're fueling growth by being a diverse and inclusive workspace. She leads on recruitment, people ops, learning and development, and culture for one of the most exciting things to come out of Boston since lobster roll. That's a personal opinion, by the way. And she's also done the yards as a marketer. She even started HubSpot's own diversity and inclusion program, creating initiatives that have increased women in leadership by 20% in 3 years. Today, I get to hang out with an all-round people-focused rock star. The 6 sessions have given me the opportunity to chat with some amazing people in the growth space. And today's guest is exciting because she not only understands marketing-driven growth, but also the people behind it. These chats are designed to be short and sweet and hopefully full of insight. And it's definitely unfiltered, which is the fun bit. So don't judge us too harshly if we say something that pisses you off. Joining us from Boston, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Katie Burke, Chief People Officer at HubSpot. Katie, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Rich, and thanks for letting me rock my HubSpot gear. Typical Friday around here, I did a workout and was running around like crazy, so appreciate the casual nature of this conversation, and certainly super grateful to the team at Six and Flow for being such great partners to us.
Oh, thank you very much. I do actually have some like partner swag on as well. I think HubSpot basically dresses me now, which is great. So thanks for that as well. First things first, as someone based in Boston, how do you feel about Brady coming out of his month-long retirement?
So controversial take. I don't care because it doesn't benefit us. So as you know, he moved to Tampa. He didn't thank us in his retirement. And so a little bit of a chip on my shoulder there. And so I am certainly happy. I think it's good for football to have him out there for as long as possible, but really it doesn't help us that much. So I'm team Pats all the way. And while I don't have any hate, obviously he did so much for our franchise and so much for New England. So very grateful and wish him well, but don't love the month retirement, like the kind of head fake kind of thing. And honestly, I'm not a Bucs fan, so it doesn't really do anything for me.
So I was chatting to Kevin Dunn about this, who, when I've always known him, he's always been a Pats fan until Brady left, and then he became a Bucs fan. I was like, how does that work? So I think
it doesn't. I love Kevin. I think we love Kevin. We have a lot of just real adoration for Kevin. I think that's a highly questionable decision. Our tenant at HubSpot is using good judgment. I think that's questionable judgment, but I'll have a chat with him about that later.
So how was 2021 for you?
So you were kind enough to send over a few of these questions before, Rich, and like the honest answer was it was a real mixed bag. So from an outside perspective, as you know, we've been super fortunate. HubSpot has grown a ton, and that's something I'm obviously incredibly, incredibly grateful for. And at the same time, as you know, we had Brian got in an accident. We had a CEO transition. For the HR team at HubSpot, it's kind of been one thing after another. And so I would just say, like, first of all, it takes a situation like Ukraine to kind of remind you we're so lucky. I'm healthy, happy. So putting it all in perspective. But 2021, I think for people leaders was incredibly tough. So I'm feeling very optimistic about 2022 and feeling excited and energized about what's ahead. But 2021 was a mixed bag for me personally and for our team.
It's and I can echo that. So like as a business, we took off. Like it was the fastest growth year we've ever had. We're hiring at a rate of knots. We've got some great client wins and like selling a lot of HubSpot and kind of engaging the community a lot. But it was so tough. I'm one of those people who thrives off bouncing around with a team, and I don't deal being stuck behind a computer too well. And I think that for me, I think it's probably the closest I've ever actually been to burnout, because I just didn't have that kind of driving bit, but it was an exciting bit. So it's kind of the yin and yang of good year, bad year.
I've been trying to be better about, I think people feel pressure to pick one or the other, right? It either needs to be great or terrible. And I'm trying to do a better job at kind of holding both at once. So even, I think had you asked me the question a few years ago, I would have felt a ton of pressure to be like, it's great, it's amazing. And now I just feel more comfortable saying, like, if I set a tone of toxic positivity on my team, it makes it really hard for someone on my team to speak up and say, hey, I'm happy HubSpot's growing, but like you, I've had to adjust on my work style, or having my kids at home has been a bit of a challenge for me in creating space for that. And so I'm trying to do a better job of like the yes and duality of how the past few years have been.
Is there like an extra layer on top of that for you though as well? Because obviously you head up and I keep calling it the people side of the business because I don't want to call you HR, because I think you're way more than my perception. You're way more than HR, but like on the people side, is there like an extra layer of, so I told you we go off piece on these questions. We're like one question in and we're already going off piece. So like, is there like an extra layer for you? Because like, I would perceive it as there's like partly showing a good face, but you're also your emotions, you're carrying the emotions of other people within the team as well. Is there that extra layer for you?
There is. So, our people operations team and any people operations team, and to your point, a lot of people get worked up about HR versus people operations. I actually don't mind either way. To me, it's about the humans we serve, so it doesn't really matter on the title. Our team is the emotional shock absorber for the entire org. And I think one tough realization for our team at one point on people operations was we were talking about how we were serving HubSpotters. We were going, okay, we stood up online classes for kids. We had a parent support network. We were bringing in experts on loneliness. We were bringing in fun stuff to keep people entertained. And we had a meeting at one point, and it was a bit like a record scratch. We were talking about people, but we weren't talking about our own leadership team. We weren't talking about our own recruiters. We weren't talking about our own HRBPs. And I think that was a tough and honestly hard realization for me of like, sometimes you're so focused on taking care of other people that you're not kind of putting the life jacket on yourself. And I think it's super important that people teams pause, acknowledge, and be mindful of that. And so we're trying to do a better job. We're not perfect at it, but I do think there's an extra layer for any people team. And so my heart goes out to anyone who's navigating people issues, whether for it's a startup, big company, doesn't matter. You've had a lot to navigate. And so I appreciate you calling it out, because it's definitely the case for our team, but also for anyone who's working this function right now.
Well, obviously, I'm not in the HubSpot organization, sit fairly close to it, but from what I hear, you guys have done an amazing job. I've never heard any complaints about the people side. So I think hats off to you guys in a pretty tumultuous year.
Thank you. Our team, honestly, I'm very, very lucky. I have the best team around.
Normally, when I speak to a HubSpotter, I ask, what is HubSpot? And it kind of feels like an almost redundant question now, because I think most people understand it. I'd rather focus on, so like, what is your role at HubSpot? What does a chief people officer do?
Yeah, so I think, as you well know, HubSpot's mission is to help millions of organizations grow better. And the way we think about it within people operations is our job is to help people grow better while they're within HubSpot. And so we really focus on, the way I think about it is my penultimate job is being the product manager for our candidate, employee, and alumni experience. And so if you think about it, I want candidates, even candidates who don't land jobs with us, to have a great experience. I want our employees to have a great experience and grow. And by the way, growth could be getting promoted and taking on new roles. It could just be having great learning experiences while you're at HubSpot. It could be stretching kind of your horizons, any of those things. And then when you move on from HubSpot, I want our alumni to be super proud. Like one thing I think is really cool is you're starting to see more people say so-and-so HubSpot alum in their LinkedIn. And I think that's a really powerful network effect, that people are so proud to be part of our alumni. And that makes me really fired up too. So that's kind of how I think about my day-to-day role.
So it just made me think of another question as well. So one of the things that we have tried to do, and it's a more recent kind of addition to our professional development plans for like our team members, is quite often, and historically, this is more kind of a poor reflection on me, is I always looked at promotion and kind of growth as in moving to the next level. Then I've got to manage people. Then I've got to do and kind of grow up that way. Whereas it wasn't until, I think it was in Kim Scott's book, The Radical Candor, but where she's talking about like the rock stars and the superstars, and you've got individual contributors, and you've got people managers. How do you, within an organization the size of HubSpot, how do you align for those? How do you make both those paths available?
It's really hard. And I think when you're growing as fast as we are, to pause and just go, how do we add intentionality to it, I think is really tough. One of the things we try and do as an executive team is embody that growth mindset from the start. So for me, one of my favorite things about HubSpot is in the before times, we always prioritized a field trip as a leadership team. And kind of Brian and Dharmesh we'd literally go door to door at different companies to learn about specific topics. And I think that's kind of core to who we are as a business and who we are as a leadership team. And so part of what we try and do is just lead from the front to go, okay, if I'm like, as an example, one of the things that I do and I'm really adamant about with my team is like, I share my self-review and our performance reviews with my entire organization. And then last week I got my review from Yamini. I shared the high level bullet points that I'm working on. And so part of it is just normalizing everyone, regardless of where you are, needs to be growing, needs to be learning, needs to be reflecting. And I think when you set that tone of humility and always learning, it just gets easier to cascade it throughout the organization. And so that's one way we think about it. The second thing is just reminding people that there are a million different ways to grow better. So actually one of my favorite examples is there's a woman named Hannah Fleischman who has worked with and for me in various capacities for years. And she was managing our employer brand team and doing a great job of it. Recently, she switched to be an individual contributor overseeing executive communications for Yamini. So absolutely pivotal, critical role, but kind of just said, I want a break. I don't know if the break from management is 6 months or 6 years. I'm not sure. We have to normalize creating opportunities like that. And so I think prioritizing the growth mindset, leading from the front with humility. And then the other thing is making sure that people know that it's not a one-way door decision. You don't have to decide to be an IC or a manager for the rest of your life. It's actually good to refine your skills on both.
I think that's one of the things I took away from that Kim Scott book was very much a like that transitional, like sometimes you will be, I think it was rock star and superstar is the terminology used, but at some point in your career, you will be one or the other and you will transition. And that for me, I think is like that reflective growth as well, is getting to understand which piece is best for you. So you didn't start out on the people side. You were a marketer, and you were even a marketing intern with the Patriots, which I think is some sort of holy grail for Bostonian marketers. Why the switch?
I think so. A few things I would say. On the marketing intern for the Patriots, I was really lucky to work for an amazing woman named Jessica Gelman. She runs the MIT Sports Conference. So that was kind of how she and I got to know each other. Now she's actually starting a spinoff basically focused on sports analytics outside of the Patriots org and serving a bunch of different sports orgs throughout the world. And so I think a few things that I learned from starting in sports. One is that you have to actually like the day-to-day work. So as an example, I think people think that working in sports marketing is super glamorous. But if you think about it, most of the brands that we know and love, so whether you think about a Boston brand like the Red Sox or Patriots or Man U or Liverpool, they're pretty established, right? The chances that you're going to get new people to think about that brand are pretty small. And so instead, what you're looking at is like incremental changes and tweaks. And by the way, you work really long hours. When you work in sports, your time is not yours. Your off season isn't really an off season for non-players. And so I think one of my learnings was like, what you think you want to do and what's interesting to you personally doesn't necessarily have to be what you do professionally. And so I really enjoyed my experience with the Patriots, but I didn't want to do it every day. And so it allowed me to kind of get exposure to it. I think as far as the transition between marketing and people operations, people think it's a huge leap. I don't think it's that big of a leap, and I think more people will be making it. And here's why. In a really tight talent market, you're competing for attention, and that's what marketers do every single day. And so for our candidates, I'm competing for attention. And then for our employees, I'm competing for attention because they could go work a million other places. And so what I like about it is you're essentially getting the marketing component, but then you're getting a little bit more ownership over the product. And so we are responsible. Our team is responsible for delivering the employee experience, but also getting people in the door. And so to me, it just feels like an extension of great marketing, and it doesn't feel so different as people might think from the outside.
I also think some of the best marketers that I know are also the people who understand people the best, like that psychology element to it. And I think so that for me, there's a natural fit. And actually, so I'm totally going to ruin one of the later questions, but one of my questions was around like your communication, like your internal communication. So I was chatting to Justin Gracie, and he was like, one of the things he knows best about you is the communications that you send out, like the monthly, like organization communications. I'm assuming the monthly or whatever time frame they are. And he was saying like you often show the words he used, so like empathy, relatability, and transparency. And so like one of the questions I had around that is that a learned skill for you, or is that something like a God-given talent, or is that how would you say to HR professionals that they should be able to kind of get better at that, and how do they learn those skills?
So first, to Justin, I would just say thank you. That's a huge compliment, and I appreciate that. Second,
I think
would
he's
say
angling for a pay rise on that, so I wouldn't pay it too much
I'll
attention.
chat with him offline about that. But all kidding aside, I think communication is something everyone has to work on. I think this notion that they're like born communicator, it's a little silly. And even, I've had to adapt my style. So if you think about it, I learned to present in front of a room with the occasional virtual presenter. And during COVID, all of a sudden, the only way in which most of the employees have ever seen me is in a venue like this. And so even if you have great communication skills, part of your obligation is to adapt those skills in a way that works for the organization and where it is. And I think what that requires is a few things. The first is listening. So you really need to make sure you're listening with empathy and understand. The second is, I think most HR professionals focus on what could go wrong versus what could go right. And so to your point, my advice to people who are focused on people, or CEOs or CMOs who are trying to communicate out to people, I think if you create a script and you mark everything up and go, oh, what could go wrong and what could get leaked, you're automatically not leaning into authenticity, and you're not feeling human. You're feeling like you're reading from a script, because you are. And so what I try and always think about is when I'm going into a tough communication about a tough issue or something that requires a lot of nuance, instead of thinking about what could go wrong, I always think about what could go right. And I really try and lean into the positivity. And the other thing is I really try and eliminate the pressure on myself to be perfect. Like, as you can tell by the fact that I'm rocking the sweatshirt, one of the best mechanisms I use to stay connected with my team, which are now over 350 people globally, is I do a weekly Loom. And it's usually sometimes it's in my gym clothes still from working out that morning. Sometimes it's the night before. Sometimes it's super business focused. Sometimes it's more personal in nature. But part of what you have to do is experiment with what works for you. And what I've found is by letting my guard down and not trying to do a perfect staged Loom, people actually enjoy it more, and the feedback I get is better. And so I would just say remove the need for perfection from global communications, and worry about what could go right versus what could go wrong.
Well, I think perfection is not very relatable, because most of us aren't perfect.
I can imagine, I think, we were talking at one point during the pandemic, and remember that part of the pandemic when everyone was cooking sourdough and it felt like everyone was really in a baking frenzy and trying to pretend everything was perfect. And we did name it. And I have not picked up a hobby. I have not baked one piece of bread ever. And it's because I've been responding in crisis mode. And I just think being that's relatable to people. And by the way, we had a bunch of people who were similarly I'm just kind of trying to get through the day. And I think sometimes people just need to hear that.
Yeah. So my wife and I at the beginning of the pandemic were trying to model the perfect kind of, it's great, we're at home, we can homeschool our kids. And then within a week, I think it was, we just need to keep our kids alive and get through the week. It's fine.
100%. I think that's much more relatable.
So HubSpot is a high growth environment. How does that affect the people side? How do you balance personal growth with the company growth?
I mean, I think we're holding on for dear life over here, given our growth. But all kidding aside, one of the things we've tried to do as a people operations team is get really disciplined around what we're not going to do. So we have a tradition where we do something called short lists, and the short lists are your no more than 5 priorities for the quarter. And then you're clear with people on what you won't do. And so part of what we're doing is creating active permission for people to say no to things. I'm a big believer, I had as my screensaver for years, you can do anything, but not everything. And that's kind of our people ops mantra is we are going to grow. We're going to grow with the company. We're going to do amazing things. But if we try and do everything, we're going to fall short on literally everything we sign up for. And so we're trying to get more intentional around what we say yes to by creating more space for what we say no to.
I absolutely love that. Permission to say no. I think it's one of those things when now that you say it, it makes complete sense, but it's not something I think I've ever kind of heard articulated or self-articulated. I think that's a great takeaway for me from this. So thanks for that.
I also think most people are people pleasers. So if you think about it, like, why would you go into people operations? Well, because you care about humans. So you hate saying no and you hate letting people down. But when you do, you end up burning out, and then you end up not being your best version of yourself. So it's cyclical. And so part of what we're trying to do is just normalize the fact that you can't do everything, even for new people on our team, so they know that's part of the deal.
How big is your people ops team?
We're about 350 people globally. And as you might imagine, a good chunk of those folks are from our awesome recruiting team. But we're building out a lot of, like, if you think about our hybrid work model, our HRIS and Workday team becomes, like, our technology stack becomes so much more important. And so those folks are critical. And then I think our HRBPs are so imperative to what we do. And then, as you mentioned, our employer brand, we don't win those awards without great communicators and marketers internally. And so we have an awesome group. And then on the learning and development side, one of the things we're trying to do is create more clear growth paths for people. And then we're building out a really awesome people analytics team to bring data into the fold. So, like, 350 people, I know sounds like a lot, but when it actually comes down to it, honestly, I think we still feel pretty stretched even at that number.
And how many total employees at HubSpot now?
Just over 6,000.
Wow, I swear that goes up by 1,000 every time I ask this question.
I feel that way too.
So about 5% of your global team is focused on the HR. Would you say that, like, is a good ratio for SaaS companies?
So I think I have a whole rant about this, so we can chat about another time. But I think actually the way that most startups and organizations think about growth and think about recruiting is completely off. It used to be kind of a line item expense. And I actually think when you think about, like, LTV to CAC on the marketing side of things, really it should be considered part of, like, the growth expense to acquire folks, because really it's part of your growth metrics. And so I personally think that it should be moved out of G&A and moved into a totally different realm, but I'll figure that all out later. And so I think that most organizations need at this point a lot of great recruiting. And I think if anything, recruiting has historically been very understaffed. And then I think now we're just at a scale where focusing on things like leadership development and manager training are more important. And so my answer is, like, we could always use more people. Do I think HubSpot has invested generously in our team? I absolutely do.
So you and your team have notched up a fair few awards: best place to work for women, parents, diversity, culture and employee choice, as well as accolades from Glassdoor, Fortune and Comparable. And I'm sure that is definitely not an exhaustive list. Does it get boring winning all of those awards? And what makes HubSpot a great place to work?
It definitely doesn't get boring. I love winning. So I think people are apologetic about wanting to win. Like, we want to be the best people operations team in the world. Like, that is our intention every day. When I get up, I want to be the best. And I want our team to be the best. I want it to be the best place to grow our careers. I want our recruiters and HRBPs to have the best time of their lives when they're here, because it pushes them, makes them better. They make us better. And so the awards to me are not about the awards. The awards are an output of all the inputs we do every single day. And so I actually don't care much about the awards. I do care that people like Justin, when you meet someone like him at a cocktail party, says it's the real deal. Like, to me, that's what actually makes me super happy and fulfilled. And so does it get old winning awards? No. Do I care about being the best? Absolutely. Do I care about the actual awards themselves? Not really. What I care about is making them real in our day-to-day work. So what I always tell people is, every time we win an award, some CEO emails their team and says, we have to beat HubSpot. And so the bar goes up for us. It doesn't go down. You don't get complacent. And so every time we win an award, I make a practice of a big award. Oftentimes I'll make a list of, where did we fall short? What was the feedback we heard consistently that we didn't react on? Because if you want to be a la Tom Brady, if you want to be the GOAT of all time, complacency has a tendency to sneak in, and I don't want to be a leader that allows for that. And so every time we win an award, I make a list of things we're not doing well and use it as motivation to win the next one.
So we have a very similar mentality with as an agency, trying to one of our kind of long-term kind of softer goals, as in hard to quantify, is that we always want to position ourselves as the challenger brand. So always looking at what we could do better, how we could be better than the people around us. Even when we get to the point where we are the incumbent, we don't want to get fat and lazy and overtaken, because I think there's always definite improvements to be had. So what is it that actually makes HubSpot special? Like, why is it such a great place to work?
I think it's So for me, it's the people we get to work with, but also the problems we get to solve. And I also think we are fully obsessed with this, right? Like, so in the same way we're obsessed with improving our product and culture and employee experience, we're obsessed with it. And so like you see Gary and Steph, my teammates, are in the chat. Like, when they give me feedback, I take it quite seriously. There's not a single Glassdoor review where we've ever gone like, oh, that's going into the bin, we don't care about it. And so for me, it's for me, what we do better than anyone is we really focus on this stuff and we care deeply about it. And we know there's no silver bullet and we act on the feedback. And to me, that's what we do better than anyone. And to answer your question, what makes it great? The fact that we give people autonomy to work on big problems and challenges, and we have a lot of fun doing it. I always think of HubSpotters as having a sense of purpose, but also a sense of humor. I think that balance is really important.
Gary Ryan says, there's no time for boring in HubSpot. Katie Burke keeps us all energized.
I do my very, very best.
HubSpot has a very well documented culture code. How do you feel culture is a strategic advantage post-pandemic?
I mean, I actually think I used to be convincing people of this 3 years ago. I kind of feel like now everyone's doing my job for me. It makes it so much easier. I think we were ahead of the trend, and I think it's impressive. I give our founders a ton of credit for being ahead of, I think they thought very early on the culture was going to be a strategic advantage, and I think they're right. I think all I got to do was pick up the ball and actually make sure we were delivering on it every day. And so I actually would say, like, to most people watching, it's kind of like welcome to the party. So we had a bit of a head start, but when you have a head start, it means you got to keep innovating, and you can't, to your point, you got to stay a challenger brand. And so I always think of us in my head as like still the number 7 best place to work, trying to eke our way up kind of thing, because it's much more motivating. But that's kind of how I think about it every day. It's like, in a competitive talent market, culture is, period, end of story, the reason we're going to win or lose. And we actually realized that when we were getting ready for our IPO at HubSpot, which was in 2014, one of the things you realize, even from hearing from bankers and investors, and now all the data is there to show it from returns, is ultimately the way that great companies endure is because of the team and the culture. And so I almost no longer, I used to like debate this on panels. I'm finding the debate is sort of weakening. Now it's more like, how do you actually do it versus why should you do it?
So, and you guys have, it's HEART is the acronym, isn't it?
Yep, that's exactly right.
And how often, what does HEART stand for? And how often do you review your culture? Like, how often do you dip back into it and try and improve it and reassess it? Because I think since I've been a HubSpot partner, so 6-7 years, something like that, it's one of the acronyms actually changed, like the same word, but the acronym changed slightly.
Yeah, so I think 2 different questions. How often do we iterate on our culture? Daily. But to me, your values shouldn't change very often. They should actually be pretty consistent. There are elements of our culture that have changed for sure. So as an example, hybrid work has certainly changed things. Diversity has become so much more important in everything we do the last few years. But our values have actually only changed once since we launched HEART. So to answer your question, HEART stands for humble, empathetic, adaptable, remarkable, and transparent. And E is the only value that changed. So it used to stand for effective, and we changed it to empathetic when we went global. And the reason for that was we started realizing that as you scale globally, there's just this tendency to go, as an example, Australia was actually the straw that broke the camel's back in the best way. Our team in Australia, right, but the Aussies, we have the least time overlap with them, right? And so and we don't have a product team down there. And so as you might imagine, it started to get to like, oh, this team dropped the ball on this, like almost people weren't assuming best intent. And we basically thought like, okay, the only way we're going to succeed is if I think that my teammates in Australia, who are amazing, we're very much in the same boat, and that it's my job to help them just as much as it's their job to help us grow our brand there. And so I'm really proud of the fact that we changed our value. Empathy is now one of my favorite values, but I think the goal should be to change and iterate your culture often, but keep your values relatively the same.
Is that, from externally focused, I would say empathy would be the one that I personally align with HubSpot most. Like, that's the one that I perceive the most externally, I think.
I think that is awesome to hear as a customer and partner. Like, that's our goal, right? Part of what you want to do is make sure that people feel like a connection on the human level. And to me, that makes my day. So thank you.
Steph McDonald has just left a comment saying, the fact that we treat our culture like a product that requires iteration and bug fixes is so healthy and allows our teams who build software and support those who do do to really understand their individual contribution? Really struggling with my reading today, actually.
You're totally fine. She's spot on, and she's one of our technical recruiters. And so one of the things, she's obviously trying to get people to who are interested in building great products. And so for me, that's critical. And I really do think, to Steph's point, over the pandemic, there have been multiple things that have come up that aren't great that we need to fix. And I think we just are unafraid of admitting that and fixing them together.
So you moved into the people side of HubSpot in early 2015. There's been one or two geopolitical car crash-like events, pandemics, wars, conflicts, movements, and many, many other emotionally charged events in that time. As a global company, how do you deal with that? How do you ensure everyone is catered for and supported, even when personal situations or opinions might diverge? Because you're in a ton of regions, a ton of different backgrounds, upbringings, kind of educations, all sorts of things. How do you align that in such a tumultuous time?
So a few things on that front. One, we have a commitment as a business that has come from the founders in Yamini from the start, that we always want to make sure we're walking the walk versus talking the talk. So as an example, I'll use two geopolitical examples that have come up in the last few years. One is Black Lives Matter. During that response, there were a ton of companies putting out statements, but not putting together a plan that they were going to act on. And one of our commitments right from the start was, what we say matters less than what we do. And so we're going to make sure our action plan is something we are all as a leadership team so committed to doing. And that in a year, we are going to be as committed to succeeding in as we are right now in this moment. And so I think that's actually helped, because we have a framework for, okay, we're not just going to say things to fit in. We're going to actually make sure we're really clear on what we're doing. The second thing I would say is, if you look at the situation more recently, like Ukraine, people want a company who does the right thing and is thoughtful and empathetic. That doesn't mean everyone is going to agree. So when you said, how do you make everyone feel catered to? I think making people feel seen and understood and heard is very different from making everyone happy with your stance. And so I think what's really hard is, I don't think we've nailed it. I don't think we've always gotten the timing right. I think there are some things we probably should have spoken up on that we didn't, and vice versa. I think what people know and have started to expect from us is, we're going to treat everyone with empathy, even when we disagree. We're going to listen to feedback when we got it wrong. And we're going to commit to really being more thoughtful about our actions than just what we say. And I think people appreciate that.
I am having like the leadership team aligned around it. It's another thing I can attest to, because when things were happening, like first started in Ukraine, not first started, like as in like the war element kicked off. I had a couple of HubSpot leadership people reach out saying, how do you think we could possibly help the partners in Ukraine and kind of Eastern Europe in this time? I think there's an element of genuine wanting to help, which is nice to see as well.
I think you're exactly right. And that's the goal, genuinely wanting to help. And then also just adding a human element to, like, this is a really tough situation. It's a heartbreaking situation. And so we have to do what we can while realizing we can't solve or address the core issues. And so I think that balance is really, really hard.
Steph McDonald, if you're still watching, I don't know if you've seen the comment. Sharon Eunice says, Steph McDonald, I love this articulation from your previous comment as well. So the pandemic blew a massive hole in how the world works. Work from home, remote, hybrid, full-time, part-time. How has it changed the way that HubSpot works?
It's changed almost everything about how we work. And so I'm really proud. I think our team did a really, really nice job of picking a route here. So we declared our stance on hybrid work pretty early during the pandemic. We picked kind of a future path relatively early. And the reason we did that was twofold. We kind of felt like our employees were looking to us to go, okay, great, I know I can move somewhere, spend time somewhere, but is my career growth going to be limited if I choose to buy a place in the countryside? What is that actually going to look like? And how do I make decisions for what's right for my family versus what's right for my career? And so part of what we want to do is pick a systemic approach to really growing hybrid that was thoughtful and inclusive. And we really saw an opportunity to meet the moment. We knew, so if you look at the data from the pandemic, it's really clear. It's a really competitive talent market right now, as we all know, but it's still not inclusive of many moms. It's not inclusive of many people who have taken a career break. Women of color are being left out of the return to work. And a lot of it is because people are making people come back to the office or trying to work the old way. And so I think I'm really proud of how we've operated things. HubSpotters around the world have 3 options for how they work. They can choose to pick a desk and work at office. They can work flexibly, which is at flex, or they can work at home, which is very cleverly at home. home. And our stipends and approaches and everything from a remote perspective are set up that way. But one of the things that we did right from the start was we removed the my manager gets to decide. And the reason for that was we believe proximity bias and a whole bunch of other bias elements even tenure bias can play into decisions around where and how people get to work. And our commitment to autonomy is such that we felt like everyone should have that opportunity, with the exception of a few roles in facilities or security where you need to be on site. I think we did a really good job of future-proofing it. And so the good news is it's meant that roughly, I think 60% of our new hires in the last year don't live anywhere near a HubSpot office and probably won't regularly go there. And so we've had to figure out new ways to work, but it's been great for our ability to recruit and retain great talent.
So in those scenarios, so you've got like 3 working models effectively there. So like the at home, at work, hybrid. I know you've called them different things, but how do you ensure that, like, how do you align your policies and kind of make sure things are like the people at home are still being catered for in the same way that the people at work? How do you balance that out?
So some of what we did, I think sometimes people want like the perfect solution, right? They want our recipe. And part of what we did was just go, okay, we're not going to have all the solutions, especially as we return to work and things get a little bit more normal. So part of what we were trying to do is actually just say, okay, part of what we can do here is to make sure that we have senior leaders who work remotely. And so if you look at our executive team, roughly half are on the West Coast, half are on the East Coast. Most of us aren't going to the office. I live in Boston. I still don't go into the HubSpot office very often. I've changed kind of the way I work and my schedule. But like our chief product officer, Steph Cuthbertson, works remotely from Seattle. And so part of what I think people need to do is be able to look up the ladder and see people who work at home and who are not penalized for doing so at the very top echelons of HubSpot. And similarly, to know that there are going to be people in the office that they'll run into, like if they're in the San Francisco office, that they will see someone like Yamini. And so part of what we tried to do is not engineer the perfect solution, but instead make sure that as people look up, they're thoughtful about it. The other thing we try and do is make sure for internal mobility roles, all roles are posted, or where we can, we try and post roles in all locations. And that is more hybrid inclusive, but it's also more globally inclusive. If you look at our teams in EMEA and in JPAC, part of the problem, as you know, when multinational companies grow, is oftentimes the quote unquote best jobs are reserved for HQ. That's something that we want to make sure we actively resist. And so hopefully it creates more career opportunity for folks, not just who are working remotely, but who are working outside the US as well.
So in an increasingly remote first environment, how can businesses better support the teams from a distance and also foster that togetherness we'd historically rely on proximity before? So like often referred to as water cooler moments, or like the Friday beers, or the playing ping pong. Like you guys had amazingly branded ping pong tables through most of your offices. How do you still foster that same kind of like togetherness?
I think this is just being honest. I think we struggle with this like every other company right now, and we're trying to figure it out. And we are hearing from our employees, they want more social connectedness. And so part of what we're trying to do is just create more moments that matter that don't have anything to do with work. I think when you're growing as fast as we can, it's easy to lose focus on that. And the reality is it does matter. It matters for inclusion and belonging. It matters how connected people feel to the workplace. And it also just makes people more excited. One good thing about HubSpot is, you know, it could be worse, right? If you spend more time with HubSpotters, you tend to like your job more. That's a good thing. Now we just need to create more space for it. And so a few things our team has been trying. It's really cool. For Carnival, our team in LATAM put together like cooking classes where anyone in the world could participate. Yesterday, for St. Patty's Day, we had tours that people could take of either Belfast or Dublin. And then we also had Irish dancing classes you could do from the comfort of your home. Part of what we're trying to do is create, I did not participate in that for a wide variety of reasons.
I'm really hoping, I think Damesh has the best living room I've ever seen on a webinar call. And I've just got visions of him doing Irish dancing in that living room.
I don't think he was there, but I'll have to check the roster there. But I do think part of what we're trying to do is create non-serious opportunities for people to connect. And I just think it's more important than ever. I think what we try and do is not copy and paste. So you mentioned ping pong. I think early on in the days, what people tried to do was go, let's take the ping pong table and bring it to virtual events. I don't think that works. And so what we're trying to do is create innovative moments that give people more time and space to share who they are personally. And we're experimenting with a bunch of stuff and we'll see what works. But like as a simple hack, one of the things we do to kick off our people ops leadership meetings is we literally do an emotional check-in, which sounds very touchy-feely, and sometimes it feels that way. but it's literally just, how are you doing? Who you ask for help? What's going on in your world? And I think that's super helpful. And so I think sometimes people are looking for these big solutions and events. And sometimes it's as simple as just going like, Rich, how are you as a human? And starting there.
So we use EOS as a framework, like loads of agencies do. And for our level 10 meetings each week, we have that initial segue type questions. So like a piece of good personal news, a piece of good business news. And there's team members on the team who it's a very un-British type of thing to do to start with. And there's an immediate aversion to it. But there's also, every time we go through that process, it just gets everybody in the room and like understanding. We have those kind of softer conversations and talking about, so my daughter was doing a dance recital and kind of like sharing that kind of news, which has nothing to do with work, but it brings us all together, which is very hard to do across a Zoom call normally.
I agree. And you mentioned it's very un-British. I also think it's very like un-tech. It's very like, un-senior leaders, that kind of thing. I think one real opportunity we have with this whole change in how we work is to just challenge what it means to be British, to be tech, to, you name it. And I think part of it is just sharing a little bit more about who we are as humans. And I think that's largely a good thing. One of my favorite AMA sessions this year was Yamini just talking about like parenting through a pandemic and how tough it is. And I think that's what people actually want, is to work with and for leaders who, to your point, are very comfortable talking about their daughter's recital and how much joy they brought them. I think the workplaces that win will be creating more space for that. So good on you for leading the way.
I read a quote from you recently when talking about whether a role should be on-site or remote. You said, when businesses leaders say, I just prefer it when I can see people on my team, it's not a good business reason anymore. How do you support people in leadership roles who grew up with that mentality, transition to be more effective leaders in this new world? So like people who originally they manage people by proximity and now they're in a position where they can't. How do you help people transition to this new working world?
Yeah, so part of what we did initially was to say, okay, if you were saying you could only train someone if you could see them, that's actually not fair from a global inclusion perspective. So as an example, I'm fortunate. Our global head of culture works out of Ireland. Our global head of ESG works out of the UK. If I had to see them for them to be effective or perceived as effective, we have a much bigger problem, because I don't know how I would even manage the flights, let alone anything else. And so part of it is just challenging that general assumption. But then part of it is also just going, okay, let's just put yourself, our value of empathy, put yourself in the other person's shoes. Would you want to feel like you work for an employer who's tracking your movements, or would you want to, as part of our commitment to autonomy, know that people trust you to do a good job? And I think that's pretty straightforward. The other thing I think that we did that really made a difference was we brought in candidate panels. So we brought in candidates and employees and asked them to basically say, tell us what your experience is like, tell us where you want to work. And that was super helpful to take personal opinions out of it. So it became less your opinion, Rich, and my opinion, and it became, this is what the market is demanding of us.
CPO, my understanding of CPOs, and there's way more to this role, but a CPO role, from my understanding, is you bridge the gap between the employer and the employee. How do you manage when the strategic direction of the business changes? So if there's a shift in focus, a shift in direction, how do you internally manage that in an organization?
I think first you start by over communicating. So one of the things we did during the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty. We had no idea in March 2020 what the pandemic was going to mean for HubSpot or for our customers or for our partners. And obviously you look back now, and for the most part, it was really good news for our business, but we didn't know that at the time. And I think the tendency from a human perspective can be to hide under your covers and just go, let's hope for the best and let's wait till we have all the answers. Part of what we did was just, we okayed with people. We did AMAs where we said, we don't know yet. Here's what we're starting with. Nobody be worried about their jobs, and here's why. And so I would just say over communicating is a big one. And then the second thing is just explaining the why. I actually think I'm a big believer in the Brene Brown clarity is kindness. I think most people can understand and accept tough news. I really do. I believe in human beings' tenacity and resilience. I just think people need to understand the why. Here's what is changing in our partner or consumer model that is actually changing the why here, and here's why we need to make the call. And if it's communicated clearly and empathetically, I think most people can take it.
Nice. This year, Six and Flow are hiring a couple of people every month with a well-defined recruitment process, but it does bottleneck around our senior team. So our senior team are involved in making hires and decisions because we're not a massive team, but it does bottleneck there. HubSpot hire hundreds of people every month. How do you build a hiring process to scale?
Yeah, so part of it is figuring out, one of the things that our recruiting analytics team is doing right now is looking at that sensitivity analysis of how many interviews is too many for a role, but also for the candidate, but also for the employee experience on that front. And so we're looking at some data on that. Once we figure it out, we will happily share it with the world. But I would say part of it starts from the very top. One thing Yamini is really, really good about is she's a great hiring manager. She prioritizes their interviews. She's proactively building pipelines. She sources people herself. And so part of when people tell me like they're spending a lot of time hiring, part of my response is like, yep, so am I. In this market, you cannot outsource recruiting to just recruiters. And yes, we have the most amazing recruiters in the world. But to your point, my job, I'm, hiring for a VP role, and in the second it goes live, my most important job is recruiting. And so part of our role is to make sure we're making space for that and attracting talent in a meaningful way. And so when people tell me they're spending too much time recruiting, I often say, like, if it feels like too much, it's probably just about right.
Good rule of thumb. I've been told, I've done that question. I'm reading up at this, the Justin Gracie question again. In your opinion, what's the most important play for companies when it comes to people? Where should they be focusing their efforts?
For all companies, I would just say responding to employee feedback. So I think our magic sauce, again, is not any specific thing. It's just really about responding to employee feedback in meaningful ways. And oftentimes people will ask us, like, what's the magic tool you use? We literally ask people quarterly using a basic survey on a scale of 1 to 10, how likely are you to recommend HubSpot? And we just work relentlessly at fixing the gaps between what we say we're going to do and what we do. The magic is in how much we care and how quickly we operationalize that change. And so for me, if I were to pick one people thing every organization should do, it's that. And then, as you might imagine, I also care deeply about diversity. And so making sure that your employee base reflects the customer base that you're trying to attract, and making really meaningful, intentional changes to change away from a culture of sameness. Those would be the two things I think every business should do.
Jessica DeCrane just said in the comments, Katie, you have a wonderful way of understanding and explaining things related to career and employee relations. I always appreciate your perspective. It motivates me when I'm feeling burned out or stuck to reframe and address my own work. And I
that is
also
so nice,
have
Jessica. Thank you.
I also have a question for you as well from LinkedIn. Sorry, I'm trying to read it. It's I understand growth is a focus and priority, but isn't growth the output of the other critical inputs of heart and not an end in an end of itself?
I would say it's both. So growth is an input and an output from my perspective. So if you help people grow in their career, I do think you feel that as a partner. I do. I think you feel that growth. I think you feel the iteration of the human you have on the other side of the phone, that connection. And so I view growth as both an input and output. I think it's a bit of a false choice to say it's one or the other. I hope that helps. Thanks for the question.
Who do you follow in the HR space? How do you keep up to date with what's going on? Where do you get your inspiration?
So I follow, one of my favorite quotes is Bill Nye, the science guy, says, I believe that every person you meet has something you can learn. And I'm a big believer in that. So like, I absolutely learn from, I do a peer call every 2 weeks with a group of fellow CHROs, and I'm listening and taking notes from them. But part of what I do is actually take inspiration and learning from everyone. Like, I'm watching what you say on Twitter and taking notes on things I can do better. I read books from nonprofit leaders, from CEOs. I believe that the best inspiration comes from companies smaller than us, bigger than us. And so I'm a huge Brene Brown fan. I am a huge Adam Grant fan. But I also take a bunch of inspirational learning from a bunch of other different types of organizations outside of tech. And I think that's super important. So I would say, like, yes to learning from HR leaders, but also learn from great marketers, great sales professionals, great lawyers, great CEOs. You need to do both.
So whenever somebody starts at Six and Flow, we end up sending out a bunch of books and promoting resources, podcasts, all sorts of stuff, because I totally agree. And from a marketing perspective, we typically learn more and kind of come up with better ideas outside of the spaces that everybody is kind of pre-populating. And I imagine the same is true from an HR perspective as well, is kind of you don't have to walk the beaten track all the time. This is my favorite.
I mean, if we do what everyone else does, we're gonna end up
there was an overlap,
like falling short. And so we always try and think of, like, one of my favorite books ever is Blue Ocean Strategy. If we do what everyone else does, we're going to fall short. And so Blue Ocean Strategy to me is like the #1 book if you're doing anything to make sure you're like zigging when other people zag. Sorry.
I've not read it. I'm going to seek it out. This is my favorite question each week is, what is your biggest career fuck up to date? So the one that you've learned the most from.
When I took over as CPO, I tried to be everything to everyone. I was the first female C-level leader at HubSpot, and I put so much pressure. Come over and been like, hey, Katie, how's it going? I think I would have been like this. I was so wired tightly, I would say, and so afraid of failure that I think I overcommitted. I think I overscheduled. I think, you name it, every mistake in the book. And ultimately it came down to the pressure I was putting on myself. What it led to was my team feeling like they couldn't fail, like they had to be everywhere at once. There was a lack of intentionality. And so I would say my first year as CPO was mostly a failure in so many different ways. So that's a big one. I didn't get into law school. Let's see, I didn't get like there's so many of them, but I would say truly on the like F up side of things, my first year as CPO, just completely putting too much pressure on myself and putting too much pressure on the people around me. That was a big one.
In that scenario, how did you identify that and how did you deal with it? So how did you become self-aware of that going on, and how did you then deal with the issue?
I mean, I got some really tough feedback. I think people tend to shy away from tough feedback. I got really tough feedback when people left the team that they were like, look, it's not that we don't believe in your vision. We don't believe in your possibility. It's just really hard to make a mistake or to feel like I can take a break or take a vacation. I got some really tough feedback from a leader who worked for me because I would send emails on the weekends. And basically she said, like, hey, you've ruined a few mornings at the park for me with my son. And you can imagine that's like a dagger to the heart. But I do think I share that because I think it's so important to share that, like, that's what makes you better. And hearing that, I don't want to be part of certainly ruining anyone's day at the park. But I think taking that human side and rather than saying, well, that's kind of on you or that's not my problem, instead going, okay, how do I create a system to fix it? And the good news about that feedback is, as hard as it was and as devastating as it was to take, it's part of how we become a best place to work for parents, because it forced me to go, what am I doing that's contributing to that? And it also meant that I was pushing other leaders from a place of vulnerability and shared growth versus like, I told you so and you better get in line here.
I love that. So, and we went through, so obviously Six and Flow was a startup, and it was kind of, I started it and then we had team members coming through, and it was originally built on my mentality of I'm going to work every hour possible to get this. And then that feeds through to the team. And we used to trade emails late at night and Slack messages and all sorts of stuff. But now, I mean, I'm not sure if you're aware, but HubSpot has an amazing tool where you can schedule emails. So even if you have the idea, you can send that. It can go out on a Monday morning. You can refrain from it. And we've blocked off people, like people don't get notifications through Slack over outside of work hours and things like that. And I think for me, that was an important adjustment for me to make, of moving from the kind of the startup mentality of every hour, every day, to actually I have a team that I need to cater for, and they have lives outside of this, and their overarching driving forces aren't necessarily the same as mine, or shouldn't be the same as mine, or can be different. I think that was an important learning from me as well.
I totally agree with that.
What are your plans for 2022?
My plans for 2022 are to actually deliver on our hybrid strategy. We have a lot of people to hire, a lot of growth. It's going to be awesome. I'm super excited about where we're going. My plans for 2022 are to take a little bit more vacation than I have the last few years, take a little bit more time off. And then on a personal note, I'm trying to run 1,000 miles. So basically get out of the house and run 3 miles every day, if and where I can, and read 50 books. So that's what I'm up to for 2022.
Nice. Are you on target for 50 books?
Yeah, I'm ahead of target. So I think I'm 14 books in for the year so far. So
Nice.
it's been
Well done.
fun. Reading brings me down to earth. It makes me more relaxed. It makes me a more tolerable person to be around. And so trying to stay on that.
David O'Grady says, I'm starting at HubSpot in a couple of weeks and listening to Katie. I cannot wait. Very inspiring. And Cara,
David, we can't wait to welcome you. And Cara is on our employer brand team. She's amazing. So hi to Cara and welcome to David.
Okay, last question, and then I'll leave you to your Friday day for you. Who should I interview next?
So I don't think you should interview him next because he's still onboarding to HubSpot. But Yogesh Chauhan is our new director of ESG, and he's based in the UK. So once he's sorted and on board, we have our forthcoming new sustainability report coming out in June. And I think you should talk to him because I think the idea of like purpose and social mission and environmental impact is going to become all the more important. And he's also our newest senior leader based out of EMEA and our new entity in the UK. And so I think and hope you would get along just great with him.
I can't wait for the invite to the opening day in the UK at some point. It has to happen at some point. Katie,
100%. We're gonna make it happen.
Katie, thanks for being up for doing 6 sessions with me. It was a lot of fun and like super insightful. Like you've given me a whole bunch of things to think about what we can do in 6 and Flow. And I think judging by the comments, it rings true for a lot of people. If anybody wants to follow up with you, how do you want them to connect?
Best place is Twitter or follow me on LinkedIn. Either of those are great with me.
And it's Katie Burke on Twitter, right?
Yep. The other Katie Burke, who has the actual Twitter handle, gets a lot of my accidents.
Katie, thank you for joining us.
Yes,
and
either of those are great. Look forward to it. And then HubSpot Life, I'd be remiss. Kara will kill me if I don't say HubSpot Life as well, because that's where all of our great employer brand content is. And thank you for having me, Rich. It was so great spending some time with you.
And are you going to be at Inbound? Will I get to see you at Inbound?
I will be there and I can't wait to see you.
Awesome. Thank you, Katie. Have a good weekend.
You too.